and on behalf of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, the Frederick S. Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future, and the Institute of South Asian Studies, I'd like to thank you for taking the time out to attend this dialogue session. This evening, we will be hearing from three guests: Dr. Adil Najam, the director of the Pardee Center; Mr. Manu Bhaskaran from the Centennial Group and also a council member of the SIIA, as well as Dr. Amitendu Palit from the Institute of South Asian Studies. To deliver the welcome address, allow me to invite to the stage the chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, Associate Professor Simon Ting.
Thank you, Mayan. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I think it's a great honor to be welcoming you all on behalf of the three organizers, the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, that I chair, my friend Adil Najam and the Frederick S Center from part of Boston University in the USA, and the Singapore Institute, and the Institute of South Asian Studies of Singapore, and part of the National University of Singapore, and my good friend Tan Tai Yong, the director. It's a great honor because not only have we got a panel, I think, of three very knowledgeable speakers about South Asia, because before that, we're going to have some comments as well from both His Excellency High Commissioner Mr. Raghavan from India, as well as my very good friend, the distinguished ambassador from Singapore, Ambassador at Large, Mr. Gopinath Pillai, who's also the chairman of the Institute of South Asian Studies. So it's really quite a packed program, I think quite a good one. Please allow me just to offer some opening thoughts about this issue. I was delighted to do this because really, so often when we look at South Asia, we look at the here and now or its very rich historical past. It was a challenge, I think, and it will be a challenge for the speakers to try to think of the longer term future. 2060 is quite a time away. I'm looking forward to hearing about it because, to me, the pictures can be so interwoven, complex, and sometimes just plain confusing. On one hand, I think South Asia is clearly emerging as part of the Pan-Asian story of growth. I was in India this year earlier as part of a conference, corporate conference organized by Asia Society. Our senior minister was there, our corporate leaders were there. We were told very exciting stories of the path ahead for India. On the other hand, everyone acknowledges a number of political stories, other challenges facing the continent as a whole, subcontinent as a whole. And so these pictures of growth sit together with these pictures of challenges and that remain to be addressed. In particular, I feel this way, this week, as we read about the tragedy of the floods in South Asia and particularly in Pakistan. This human tragedy, of course, it's even broader than South Asia. It's there in China. There are issues, climate change, it seems to me, everywhere. But I think particularly this moment, I feel strongly about this terrible human tragedy in South Asia and particularly Pakistan. And so, on that, could I ask you to join me, stand for a minute of silence, please. Thank you all very much. I was very heartened to hear that Singaporeans and the Red Cross will be making some efforts to do our little bit to try to address some of the issues there. South Asia, whether it is the floods or whether it is the promise of growth, really is a very important region that Singapore, I think, understands slightly better than other parts of East Asia, Southeast and East Asia. When I was in America at the Asia Society, I felt that they were kind of obsessed with China. That even though they was called the Asia Society, they would think China first, China second, China third, and then perhaps the fourth would be India, and the rest of us wouldn't get much attention at all. I think in this sense, while we have asked the High Commissioner from India to speak, we really want to keep this forum about South Asia, of course, and India is a vital, important part of that. With over 1/5 of the world's population, a critical geostrategic location, two, not one, but two nuclear weapon states, South Asia needs no underlining how important it is. Beyond these sort of broad issues, there's also the human factor, the economic factor, and questions of nature and natural resource challenges. So really, I think what happens in South Asia will impact not only South Asians, but those of us, as we are in Singapore, who have deep interactions with South Asia, and indeed the global stage. So we find that while there are a lot of literature that looks at the specific countries in the region, the regional point of view and the longer term point of view is something that really there is a bit of a gap in thinking about this. And so we're really delighted, as I said, to have been challenged by the Pardee Center to hold this event in Singapore. Adil is holding similar events elsewhere, and in a sense he will get from this a very global view of different visions of the region's future. And we are very happy that the speakers we've got, and our two keynote speakers, of course, have risen to the challenge. So, without further ado, please allow me to thank and then welcome the speakers. First, I want to thank, of course, His Excellency Mr. Raghavan, High Commissioner of India, Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Ambassador at Large from Singapore, the speakers who formed His Excellency, Dr. Adil Najam, in the front row, my good friend Manu Bhaskaran, and Mr. Palit from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, where he's a Senior Research Fellow. So thank you all very much for making this. I look forward to learning much more about South Asia.
Thank you, Simon. To give us opening remarks, please welcome the High Commissioner of India, Dr. Raghavan.
Simon Tay, Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, my friends and colleagues, the High Commissioners of Pakistan and Sri Lanka, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me here today and to deliver these opening remarks. I think I should begin by warmly congratulating all the organizers for this initiative. This is a long vision. And I think when one is deliberating on a long vision, it's better to be the first speaker rather than in the middle or in the end. So I will limit myself to one or two ideas, which I don't necessarily have to flesh out, because there are a number of speakers after me. And we'll begin by saying that when one is looking at the next half century, I think the past is an uncertain time. History, however captivating, cannot enlighten us beyond a point. Perhaps a more meaningful way of addressing the challenge of the future would be to look at certain broad trends and structural forces at play and stand back, as Simon Tay said, from the immediate. So I'll limit myself to looking at two broad structural forces which I think are at play. One is internal to our region, and the other is really an external factor or an external view, our external view. Of course, I'm informed by an Indian perspective, but I would like to think that this is something which many in South Asia and perhaps in the rest of Asia also would be thinking on these lines. The internal factor I would begin by addressing when one is looking at a 50-year perspective ahead is the dialectic or the debate between growth and empowerment. I think this has informed a great deal of South Asian especially Indian, but certainly in the rest of South Asia and perhaps elsewhere in Asia too, a great deal of South Asian political economy in the last 20, 30 years. I would like to think that in the next 20 years, this debate will be far more harmonious than it has been in the past, that we will find a better balance between empowerment and growth. Certainly my own view of the Indian experience is that it is going to be a far more harmonious balance. It's an extremely challenging perspective. I think the whole of South Asia, regardless of the political systems which have prevailed, have had a kind of societal freedom which has given to this debate between empowerment and growth a cutting edge which you often don't find in other parts of the world, or at least not to the same extent. The second issue which I would like to focus on is the external vision. And I think there what is going to be critical for all the countries of South Asia is the extent to which we will craft and have our own perspective of regional and international affairs. This may sound trite, but in fact is not. I mean, if one looks back, for instance, in the last 30 or 35, 40 years of our history, the choke points or the tipping points of critical importance to South Asia or Asia are quite different from when seen from an Asian perspective or from a European or Atlantic perspective. If you read the European or the US discourse, the critical year in recent history would appear to be 1989. It's the end of the Cold War, the beginning of the downfall of the Soviet Union and the pulling down of the Iron Curtain and so on. If you see it from our perspective, I think 1979 is a far more critical year. It's the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It is the Iranian revolution. It's the year of major Vietnam-China clashes. I think all of which have had tremendous impacts on the course of the next 20, 30 years. I think this regaining of our own vision of international affairs is going to be critical in the political economy of the next 30 to 40 years. I think our regaining this vision is going to be enormously strengthened and become, in fact, more of a reality than it has been in the past, primarily because of the shift of economic power, which we are going to witness at an increasing pace over the next two decades. I really find myself unable to continue on these lines because one can go on and talking about this perspective for a great deal of time, but I really thought that these two ideas in terms of our internal dynamic and also our external vision of the world, if one stands back from immediate day-to-day events and tactical issues, are critical as we look at the next 20, 30 years of our future. Thank you very much for inviting me again. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. To deliver this evening's keynote address, please welcome Ambassador at Large for Singapore and Chairman of the Institute of South Asian Studies, Ambassador Gopinath Pillai.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I see half of my size here, so the hall is full because of my colleagues trying to see how the chairman is going to fall flat. Dr. Raghavan, High Commissioner of India, High Commissioners for Pakistan and Sri Lanka, Professor Simon Tay, Chairman, Singapore Institute of International Affairs, Professor Adil Najam, Royal Boston University, distinguished guests, panelists, eminent guests, friends, ladies and gentlemen, sorry. I am indeed deeply honored to address this illustrious gathering on South Asia's future. Let me state right at the outset that I'm a believer that South Asia has a future. However, Professor Simon Tay did mention that history may not be a guide to the future, but I would like to start with a little bit of history and going back some 2,000 years. The term South Asia came into use only recently. The common perception is that it is a disparate group of countries with different languages, cultures, and religions, which was once held together by the might of the British Empire. Some of them look similar in their appearances, but they are quite different. This view, to me, is not quite correct. Historically, this contiguous region, stretching from present-day Afghanistan to Bangladesh, both countries inclusive, had a common identity. It may not have been a political entity under one supreme ruler, but it was a cultural entity. And the Persians referred to this region as Hindustan, not meaning country of the Hindus, but the country around the Indus Valley and the land beyond to the east. The cultural entity was broken up by successive invaders. First, the Muslim invaders, Islamic invaders, and then the Western powers. The present architecture that you see in the region has been largely what Western powers left behind when they gave up their rule in the middle of the 20th century. In this 60-odd years since the region came out of colonial, the one factor which has affected the region from becoming a more cohesive entity has been the animosity between the two major powers in the region, namely India and Pakistan. The tension between these two countries has remained unabated. They have fought some wars, and one of them rather serious. We saw the dismemberment of Pakistan and the creation of Bangladesh in 1931. A second negative feature of the region has been the growing insurgencies in almost all the countries in the region. Separatist movements such as Khalistan in India, Tamil Eelam in Sri Lanka have been somewhat brought under control or ended, as in the case of Tamil Eelam. But other forms of insurgencies have surfaced. The Naxalites in India, the movements in the northwest of Pakistan, these are gaining ascendancy. The third trend, which is again something that is disturbing and seldom admitted, is the growing corruption in this area, in these countries, which has led to the erosion of the integrity of the public institutions. On the positive side, there has been significant economic growth in the region. Calamities like the Bengal famine during the time of the British is unthinkable in today's South Asia, although poverty is still widespread. Economic growth has brought improvement in public health, in education, and significant advancement in technology, particularly in India. With this backdrop, I would like to take a rather micro approach and look at the various countries separately, not using an overall analysis of it, and see how things are going to evolve. Things are going to evolve in the next 50 years. First, let me start with the largest country, India. South Asia's long-term outlook and prospect will significantly be determined by those of the Indians. Being the largest country and economy in the region, India's future development will shape the region's political and economic outcomes. In several ways, India holds the key to a prosperous and stable future for South Asia. Current indicators point to a reasonably bright future for the Indian economy. It is growing at the rate of 7.4%, barring any exigencies shocks such as natural calamities, major political upheaval, India should comfortably achieve growth rates of between 8 and 9% in the coming years. Rise in domestic savings, investment rates, accompanied by steady growth in consumption and overall demand, should see India reaching double-digit rates of growth in GDP. Popular forecasts on global growth, including celebrated ones such as Goldman Sachs forecasts, point to the Indian economy becoming one of the 3 largest economies in the world by the year 2050. But then all forecasts have to be taken with a strong pinch of salt. At the size of US 1.3 trillion, the Indian economy is currently the 12th largest in the world. Sustained high growth over the next couple of decades can easily push India in the top bracket of world economies. This will not only increase its global economic clout, but it will also result in a commensurate increase in the global political and strategic significance. Hopefully, such growth will arise. Such growth will also see a reduction in the poverty of the country. The remarkable rise in economic growth rates India has much to do with the emergence of a vibrant, dynamic, visionary private sector. I expect the Indian private sector to be much more active as global players in the years to come. The biggest downside to India's high economic growth is its limited success that it has had so far, making growth more equitable and a balanced process. This is evident from the large number of poor people in the country. Some estimates suggest around a third of the Indian population, roughly 400 million people out of a total population of 1.2 billion, living in abject poverty. I do not see a rapid transformation of this situation in the immediate future. India's success in achieving high growth will, among other things, depend on the ability to build a technically skilled labor force. The country's current training capacity of 3 million is hardly enough given the fact that 12 million young men and women come into the market looking for jobs each year. Building capacities for imparting technical skills is going to be a critical determinant of India's future economic success. Another factor that India has to look at is the politics in the neighborhood. That is going to be a critical challenge for India. India's ability to grow sustained high rates will strengthen if favorable conditions prevail in its neighborhood. India's relations with its neighbors in the rest of South Asia have experienced several highs and lows, depending on evolving circumstances. Stability in the region is essential for India's continued growth. Let me make one final point on India. Indian democracy, which is often criticized for being a roadblock to fostering economic growth, is to me a safety valve which helps it to manage the numerous problems arising from its own diversity. And this is one thing that gives me optimism when I talk about India. Its system of government, democratic system of government, can also serve as an example as the most acceptable form of government for the other countries of the region. Next, I'd like to look at Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a country with great promise and potential, given its geographical location, educated workforce, and strong human development indicators. It was ideally poised to play a key role in the East and South Asia growth story. At present, both the country and its economy are at crossroads. If the newfound peace stabilizes and consolidates, then Sri Lanka can gradually wean back investors and regain the confidence of the international community in its economic capabilities. That would see the country charting a course of economic recovery through active participation in regional trade and commerce. However, it is still too early to assert with confidence that Sri Lanka will be able to travel on the peaceful route to economic prosperity. Much will depend on how successfully the current and future political establishments in Sri Lanka manage ethnic sensitivities for maintaining socio-political harmony. Next, Bangladesh. The country appears to have entered a phase of political stability. Bangladesh watchers will expect that political stability continues and entrenches itself, since it is an essential prerequisite for the country's economic takeoff. The economy is currently cruising along at a growth rate of 6% plus. Workers' remittance will contribute to provide strong support to the Bangladesh economy, as does the robust services sector. One distinct feature of the country, that it is in the entire South Asian region, as well as probably a good part of the developing world. In terms of success, it has achieved in reducing rural poverty. It has been the most successful country in reducing rural poverty. Its successful experiment with microcredit and economic empowerment can be a useful lesson for several countries grappling with the challenge of managing chronic poverty. The country can indeed climb on to a higher growth trajectory, provided it does not experience problems of religious fundamentalism and concomitant inward-looking social postures. Pakistan. Pakistan is the second largest country, and I remember the days when I used to get the Singapore State Trading Corporation. The place I used to love going was Pakistan, because Singapore had a lot of trade. While India banned the import of palm oil from Singapore, Pakistan had no problem buying this from us. So we had an extremely good relation. But currently, I think it's a country which causes some concern. Violence and bloodshed have severely crippled the country's economic outlook. This is indeed unfortunate, since Pakistan has enormous economic potential on account of its significant geostrategic location and abundant natural resources and excellent human resources. Much of Pakistan's current problem can be effectively addressed if the country is able to strengthen its democratic institutions and strike a functional balance between the military and the civil authorities. The country's political stability is also intricately linked to the prospects of peace and stability in Afghanistan. As of now, Pakistan's economic and political outlooks do appear somewhat grim compared to the rest of South Asia. However, an improvement in internal security situation and a hard and decisive push on economic reforms can definitely produce considerable benefits to Pakistan in the coming decades. Afghanistan. The current situation in Afghanistan as well point to a rather depressing outlook. At this point in time, most observers are waiting for external troops to pull out from the country. And many people view this with great fear and apprehension. I feel that this could be what Afghanistan requires. It is quite possible that the withdrawal of external military presence may help the warring factions come to terms with each other. Afghanistan's own terms, however, should encourage it to adopt a more proactive engagement policy towards neighbors, particularly Iran, Pakistan, India, China, and Russia. The last country that I'm going to talk about in South Asia is Nepal. We have experts of Nepal in here, so I will be very careful for the Munis. They're experts in almost all the countries. But Nepal, it's unfortunate that this Himalayan kingdom has been affected by political instability and has not been able to achieve economic potential. A commercially active and politically stable Nepal can serve as an effective business conduit between South and Northeast Asia. However, that has yet not happened, and Nepal has been a victim of repeated political disturbances and instability. It can look forward to a brighter and prosperous future, provided it can get its political system in order and devote more attention and energy to the economic growth. Let me now sum up my vision of South Asia in 2060. First, I do not think the region will be transformed into a region of peace and tranquility by 2060. India, economically the star performer, will continue to be plagued by the Kashmir problem, for which I see no immediate solution in sight. Domestically, I find the Naxalite problem worrisome, but considering India's successful record in handling such crises, I feel the problem can be solved. Eradication of poverty will remain a challenge. Two other bright spots could be Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. Sri Lanka particularly has the wherewithal to make a quick turnaround, provided the Tamil minority has been successfully integrated. Countries of major concern are Pakistan and Afghanistan, and their futures are linked. I'm afraid that Afghanistan may turn into a major battleground, and this may happen because the Americans are pulling out, the NATO is pulling out, but it's likely to happen. I'm not at all suggesting that they should remain to maintain the peace, because it doesn't happen that way. I see it as a battleground because both India and Pakistan will vie for power and influence, and other countries like China, Russia, and Iran will also join in. America, to use David Cameron's famous words, will look both ways. I do not see a clear positive picture emerging in this area. I wish to conclude this talk with a question. And the question is this: will the present architecture of the region sustain in the next 50 years? Some of you may have wondered why at the beginning of the talk I had started with going back 2,000 years in history to talk about a contiguous area with a common identity. I did that because it is in stark contrast to the fragmentation of the territory, and it still continues, the last one being Bangladesh. My view, in spite of the many negative signs I see, is that it is unlikely that there will be further fragmentation, breakups of this region. I say this in spite of the nascent separatist movements in Northeast India and the Pushtun areas of Pakistan. The governments of India and Pakistan have learned to handle such situations, which makes me optimistic about the future. Let us hope my optimism is not unjustified. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll now move into a quick question and answer session with both the Ambassador as well as the Commissioner. May I invite our guests to take a seat? This question and answer session will be moderated by Professor Tay. May I invite you to direct your questions to a particular person or to the panel in general. And when you ask your questions, please do state your name and where you're from. Thank you.
Thank you for your very forward-looking speech. I just wondering, I'm not very sure about the bright future of Sri Lanka. You know that every nation got a chance when they successfully get their population transition done, what we call the demographic window. So Sri Lanka had the opportunity, and you mentioned that Sri Lanka got its social indicator right, but their demographic window already closed. You will see the more old people than young people. But Sri Lanka has not been able to translate these better social indicators into economic growth, and after the war, things are not looking that bright. Thank you.
May I take one more question perhaps, and then
I'm Dan Jaratlega with the ISIS. It's not a question, it's a comment. I wish to commend High Commissioner Raghavan for a particular point he made. He made two major points. The second one about a distinctive Asian vision of international relations, which dovetails really with some of my own research. He made the point that it wasn't for example, it wasn't 1989, but from our perspective, 1979 was far more of a nodal point. I cannot but agree very strongly, and I think that that's a very good point of departure. I hope that institutions in Singapore and other parts of Asia would actively help in setting up the kind of discussion that enables us to look back at perhaps the history of the Cold War and other issues in contemporary current history from this Asian perspective, because the vantage point is different and the range of experience is different, than the entire narrative, chain of causation, and even conceptual product tends to be far more representative of our own experience. So I must commend the High Commissioner for having made that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a third question or comment? Not by venture one that I can see. I was always been entranced by India's look east policy. India certainly has been the foremost South Asian country to come in a way into the East Asia, Southeast Asia circle. But I wondered whether it was in a way a kind of substitute for a near abroad strategy. And whether in the next 50 years, while it will pursue a look east policy, it might also have to think through again how deeply and how best to engage its near neighbors. I know there's SARC, but my impression is that SARC has not been the kind of success it was originally hoped to be. Whether fresh thinking would be something that we will see in the next 50 years. So those are the sets of questions or comments in one case. Could I ask Kopina to respond first?
First to comment on Shahidul's also a comment. I think he felt that Sri Lanka, there are still problems. I say that Sri Lanka has a very good chance of a quick turnaround because of what I know about the people of Sri Lanka. It has got a small population, it's not an unwieldy sort of situation, but better educated than most of the other countries. There are very well educated people in India, in Pakistan, Bangladesh. But in proportion to the population, they are insignificant. Whereas Sri Lanka being a small country, it has greater impact on the people. My concern about Sri Lanka is that there is a considerable amount of the economy has been all along been in the hands of Tamils. And if you cut them out, to reinstate is going to be difficult. But there are also very successful commercial people among the Sinhalese. I'm not saying that they are not, but I feel that the Tamil integration is necessary. But if the political equation is right, then I think Sri Lanka will make it.
Thank you very much. I think on the issue of the question of look east, I think if one looks at it historically, there's the look east policy in fact is a response to or is really India regaining a sense of its place in the world, which it lost due primarily to 2 centuries of colonial rule, but also on account of a 40-year period of the Soviet Union. I think we lost 3 critical senses. One was a sense of Central Asia. The second was a sense of Southeast and East Asia. And the third was the sense of our naval or oceanic heritage. I think regaining these three perspectives is critical for India as it looks outside in the next 20, 30 years. I think on the second aspect of near abroad, I agree with you entirely. I think the challenge for India, as indeed for the challenge for all the countries in South Asia, is how to develop a more harmonious relationship and how to have institutions which would enable us to have that kind of harmonious relationship. I'm so sorry.
Okay, you're the one speaking. So. Don't worry. It's urgent to begin.
No, that's not it. Finally, I think on the question of regaining an Asian perspective, I don't mean it simply as an ideological or intellectual exercise. If one looks at the history of the last 50 years, if you see the divisions of Europe as a result of the Cold War, they've largely healed. Whether it's in Germany, the division between East and West Europe. But if you look at Asia, it is not so. The subcontinent is one example. The Korean Peninsula is another example. The situation in Palestine is a third example. What is there in Cyprus is yet another example. I think regaining a perspective of our own means really addressing these issues from the viewpoint of one's own history rather than externally engineered solutions.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Mr. Palit, I'll come back now.
Just a little bit on this look east. I think knowing South Asia, I feel that South Asian mindset is still very much Western oriented. They look to America, to Europe, they are not particularly interested in Southeast Asia. This is my reading. Now, of course, it's changing, but it is changing at a glacial speed. You know, gradual, it's hardly noticeable. And this is very surprising. Once again, you go back into history. The major cultural influence on Southeast Asia is from South Asia, not from China. Many of the states in Southeast Asia paid homage to China, but culturally it was South Asia. Whether it is Islam, whether it's Hinduism, whether it's Buddhism, it came from South Asia. So it was completely forgotten, and it is changing, but too gradual for my life.
Oh, thank you, Ambassador High Commissioner. Thank you very much. We'll now move on to the next panel, panel one. So thank you very much.
Please join me in thanking Ambassador Wapana and High Commissioner Raghavan. Thank you very much. Well, tonight we are very happy to be hosting three experts who hail from all over the world, actually. We have first Dr. Adil Najam, the director of the Frederick S. Pardee Center, Boston University. He will be speaking on South Asia, Thinking Regional Futures. Our second speaker is Mr. Manu Bhaskaran, who is a partner and member of the board of Centennial Group and also a SIA council member, who will be speaking on the impact of China's rise on South Asia. And finally, we have Dr. Amitendu Palit, who is a visiting senior research fellow from the Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore. And he'll be speaking about South Asia in the Asian economy. Please join me in welcoming them. May I invite you to take your seats, please? The panel will be moderated by Simon.
Well, thank you again, Mayor. We've had the introductions to the speakers. I've been very fortunate to know a number of them personally, and Adil really has been a friend for a long time. But I shan't detain you all, because I mean you have probably, you can always Wikipedia them or Google them. And I think substantively is what you come to hear, their ideas about the long-range future of South Asia. So may I just, in a way, jump straight ahead and invite Adil Najam to share his thoughts with us.
Thanks.
Yeah, please, go ahead and speak to me. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon, for that kind introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I really have two things to do. First, I'll wear my Pardee Center hat and do a round of thanks, which are really heartfelt and truly deserved. I wanted to thank Simon and SIIA for hosting this, organizing this. I had a wonderful morning at ISAS, and I want to thank them for that hospitality as well as being here. I also wanted to actually thank my colleague Elaine Kang, formerly of SIIA, which demonstrates that globalization still needs people to connect, and is partly the reason why at least I am here and we were able to do this. But I really do want to thank all of them. I wanted to do two things very briefly. First, I wanted to say something about the larger project of South Asia 2060, and maybe explain why we are doing it. One always has to explain these round numbers, why it isn't 2059, for example. And then I want to maybe share a few of the broad themes that are coming from the project till now, which very much actually coincide with the ideas that we just heard from the speakers. First, on the Pardee Center, we have a wonderful name. We have the Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. We have a precise meaning for that, and the meaning is we look at the future 35 to 200 years from now, which means that I have the world's best job, because whether I'm wrong or right, by the time they figure it out, I'm not there. But jokes apart, we actually do take the future seriously. And we take the future seriously not because we are arrogant enough to believe that we can tell the future. We can't. Although one of the chapters in this project starts with the line that South Asia has the world's highest number of futurologists. They're called astrologers and palmists. It is an ancient and proud South Asian profession. But the reason we take the future seriously is not because we think we know what tomorrow will bring. We take the future seriously because we are really interested in today. We are not as much in the projection or prediction business, but we are in the business of trying to shake up the framework of that short-term thinking and maybe change the perspective enough so that we start thinking about today differently. So our interest in tomorrow really stems from the today, and it does make people think differently from whatever path dependence they are on. The South Asia 2060 project is actually one of multiple series of projects. We have a project called Africa 2060, we have another project called Latin America 2060, and we have this project called South Asia 2060. This is done slightly differently from the other two. In this case, what we have done is we have about 30 thought leaders, including my two colleagues on the panel, from across the world, that we asked to think about what South Asia's future may hold. Not to predict, but to put themselves into the future and write a back history of what might happen, but really to think about what are the triggers of today that might impact tomorrow. So we have some really outstanding people apart from my two colleagues. We have, for example, the governor of the State Bank of Pakistan writing about the economy. We have the vice chancellor of the University of Jammu and Kashmir in India writing about security. We have the former IT minister, information technology minister of Sri Lanka, thinking about that. Some of my favorites are, we have one of the leading sports reporters from South Asia thinking about cricket, and thinking about cricket in terms of identity. We have art critics and so on and so forth. So the reason of bringing all these people together is to again shake up the box and say, if we think about different things, do we come with different ideas? Why are we holding this event in collaboration with our colleagues in Singapore? Because we also wanted to look at how a region and a place that looks at South Asia seriously, but is not in South Asia, thinks about that. And so we did one in the US, and we are doing the other here in Singapore. So that's really where I'm coming from, and I'm sorry to set that up, but I thought it was important. The output of the project is going to be a book that will be published early next year, which will collect these 30 essays and try to start driving from them a tapestry of visions and bind them together. And what I wanted to do very briefly as I end is to maybe raise for you 5 of the main ideas that are coming from that, and my colleagues may or may not sort of agree with those. The first point I want to make before I raise those 5 is, if you really want to think seriously about 2060, I would encourage you to do what our speakers did, is to look back at 1960. Think of these countries and what they were in 1960. And I think that is a sobering exercise, because 1960 South Asia is so different for each of those countries. Pakistan is the growth motor. If you're looking at 1960, the big growth engine in South Asia is supposed to be Pakistan. If you are looking at 1960, Indian economy is being defined in terms mainly the opposite of what it is today. Not just in terms of growth, but in terms of ideology. If you look at 1960, there isn't a Bangladesh. But the sobering part of looking at 1960 is how different we are today from where we were 50 years ago. And that should give us pause to think that maybe where we will be in 2060 is not going to be determined by the headlines of today, but the larger internal trends of today, which are far more important. And those are the big trends. 5 things that come out of at least the papers. We are still in the business of editing them. 5 important things. 1 is issues of identity. 2nd, issues of history. 3rd, issues of equity. 4th, issues of conflict. And 5th, issues of identity. That wasn't a mistake. That wasn't a mistake. Those are 2 separate identities. The first issue of identity is the emergence and the struggle for an internal South Asian identity. We have Steve Cohen writing about this, we have some art critics writing about this, we have historians writing about this. But the issue of an emerging South Asian identity, one of our authors starts his paper, or in the beginning of his paper says, South Asia has a future, but does it have a past? And that goes back to your question. And he's talking really about this South Asianness, which in fact this region, which has so much in common in terms of culture and history and language and cricket and all sorts of other things, in fact is the most loose of all the major regions in terms of its institutions, whether it's SARC and so on and so forth. So those issues of an emergent South Asian identity within South Asian relations becomes a very, very important one, and most of our authors are sanguine about that. Here is one of the interesting things about this. None of our authors, 30 papers as I said, and authors from all parts of the region, really question the idea of South Asia. And to me that was a surprise, because in our invitation we had said, you know, maybe there isn't a South Asia. Maybe there is some of these countries sort of start looking at Central Asia and other looking at the ocean and so on and so forth. None of them raise the notion of a South Asia not being there. They all raise notions of tensions, but that to me is a surprise. It's also a surprise to me how few of the papers ever really talk about a Central Asian connection, or how little, and this goes back to the last point, how little Asia comes up when they are talking about South Asia and non-South Asia. So this notion that you were saying, you know, it looks west, is very clear in these papers. That maybe it's the colonial mindset, but the ultimate destination is westward, not eastward, and that I thought was very, very interesting. The second point of history, and I already said, you know, does it have a history or not, is an extremely important one. As I said, people are in fact in general in these papers, and this may be self-selection of who we are asking, generally positive about South Asia's future. The disputes in the papers, when you read them together, are mostly about the past. The one thing that you would have thought they could agree on is in fact where a lot of very different perspectives come in. And the sense of the present is entwined in these different perceptions of what the past has been, rather than from the shared or not shared vision of what the future might be. The future they tend to agree with. The past is what they seem to disagree with. And I thought that again is a very important thing. The third thing of equity was raised by the High Commissioner, and I think is a very, very important point. It comes up again and again and again. That there are multiple South Asias, and nearly most of our Indian authors write about how there are multiple Indians. And how taking those multiple South Asias together is going to be the big challenge. that as this difference in equity and development goes into the future, how does that tear or not tear? Each of the countries of the region is a divided society according to our authors, each of them. In some cases, in nearly all cases economically, in some cases including my own country, Pakistan, there are multiple layers of division, religious and ethnic and so on and so forth. But each of them is a divided issue, and until those internal divisions are sorted, our authors seem to think that the conflict issue, of course, is all over the region in every country. But one of the things that all of our authors seem to be clear about, one is that the region's future is entwined with the choices India makes as the largest and overwhelmingly large country in the region about the region's future and its own future and how it sees integrated into it. And second, again and again, Pakistan comes up. Now, this is a particular challenge because both of us editors are from Pakistan, so we try to sort of make sure we are. But India and Pakistan overwhelm the discussion. And the shadow of the India-Pakistan conflict is particularly interesting when you read chapters that are written by authors who are not from India and not from Pakistan. One of the things that we usually do not think about when we think India-Pakistan is the impact that relationship has on everyone else in the region and the choices that they have to make in terms of, so that the overwhelmingness of the India-Pakistan tension on the region is one of the, according to our authors, the biggest drags on the thing. The last point, and to me the most interesting point in many ways, is the issue of identity again, and that is the creation of the global South Asian identity. And the global South Asian, if you really want to see global South Asia, I would recommend one of the most interesting places, actually one of the most interesting places is here in Singapore for reasons that you mentioned, but one that is as interesting to me is a country called Suriname. Suriname is a country in the Caribbean, but is not an island. It is a country in Latin America, but it doesn't speak Spanish or Portuguese, it speaks Dutch. And it is essentially a South Asian country. And you look at this country, you go to this country, and you find this amazing sort of South Asianness tucked in this little corner of Latin America. And the point I'm trying to make here is that there is a global South Asianness emerging, which is in fact beyond anything happening in South Asia itself. It is happening through diasporas, it is happening through entrenched diasporas, which are creating a South Asianness of their own, no longer dependent on the home countries. You see that in Britain, with, for example, what would be called the Pakistani diaspora. You see that in the US with the Bollywood, with sports, with music, with arts. One of my favorite examples, and I was mentioning this, and I'll end here this afternoon at lunch with some of the ISS colleagues, is that for the longest of times, that is the 10 plus years that I've been teaching, in every US campus, you would have these cultural shows that had the Garba dance, which is the Gujarati dance. And you would also have these Bhangra dance. These are two types of dances coming out of South Asia. Bhangra is very popular in the Punjab, both in Pakistan and India. Garba is very much Gujarati. Essentially now every campus in the US is overrun by Bhangra. Every university has a Bhangra team. That's not interesting. What's interesting is that most of these teams do not have South Asians. Veri was telling me she's taking dancing lessons in Bhangra, where the teacher is a Chinese and everyone studying is a Caucasian American. And now this sounds silly, but it is not. It is the creation of a different type of South Asianness that is defining trends within South Asia. You see that in Bollywood, rather than the other way around. So there is a South Asianness that is there. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you very much, Adil. I think those observations were very interesting. It's just a matter of timekeeping. The Adil Najam did not get more time because he's a co-organizer. He got it because he came from very far away. The other two speakers came much nearer by. So I'll be a bit unfair on them. But may I please call my good friend, Mr. Manu Bhaskaran from the Centennial Group, to give his thoughts to us. Manu.
Thank you, Simon, distinguished guests. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. I've been asked to talk about the next 50 years, which is hazardous in the best of times. and particularly about a region like South Asia, which has changed so much, as we've just heard. So with that qualification, let me just look in my crystal ball and try my best to sketch out what I think we could think about South Asia in 2060, and specifically the impact of China on the region. I'd like to make 3 points. One is that I think by 2060, China will be as much a South Asian political, military, and economic power as it is an East Asian one. And whether the rest of South Asia likes it or not, I think that is going to be a reality. The second is that the simultaneous rise of India will, I think, inevitably lead to tensions between China and India. It sounds very deterministic to say so, but weighing the pros, the cons, and everything, my judgment call would be there will be episodes of significant tension, problems between China and India that will mark this period to 2016. Thirdly, there will be elements of complementariness and competitiveness in the economic relations between South Asia and China. But I suspect that overall, despite what I said about China and India, I think the relationship will be largely complementary rather than competitive. So, before I make these points, I just want to sketch out very quickly what China and South Asia would look like in 2060. And just very, very quickly, clearly the global economy is going to be a much bigger economy by then. But within that, the composition clearly will shift. The United States, major European nations, and Japan will have a much smaller weight in global GDP, but I think they will still dominate the top 15. Given their starting points, even with a much slower rate of growth, they will still be very much in the top 15. But clearly China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, because of their sheer size and the likely growth will also be there. Secondly, I think what we will see is what I call the rise of the laggards. In the last 30 years, what we've seen is countries that organize themselves very well, with very strong governments that took the right policy decisions. These are the countries that outperform. I think over the next 30, 40 years, we will see other kinds of countries that rely more on the slow accumulation of incremental reforms, which over time have a powerful effect. These will come to strength. And I suspect many of the South Asian economies will be in that category. So they will surprise on the upside, despite having all kinds of problems, infrastructure, governance, and the like. The trajectory of the global economy from here to 2060 will probably be marked by considerable volatility, stresses. I think what we saw in the global financial crisis is only a foretaste of more to come. I think we're over the period of easy growth, relatively easy growth that we saw in the last 30 years. China in 2060 will probably be the largest economy in the world. And while its per capita income will still lag those of the rich countries today, it will still be a fairly prosperous country. Its population would by then have been outstripped by India's, but China would still be the second largest population in the world. It will become the largest consumer market, a market that producers will not be able to ignore, where today a Japanese auto producer might make a car with basically the American consumer in mind. By 2060, even if the Japanese are still making cars, they will be making cars for the Chinese consumer or the Indian consumer in mind. So they'll have a tremendous presence in the global market. Chinese companies would have become substantial presence, having a footprint in most parts of the world. Chinese investment in research and development would have paid off in the form of patents and dominance of certain technologies in different segments. China's substantial and continuing investment in military hardware, software, intelligence would also have allowed it to become a much more substantial and impactful global power. At the same time, South Asia will also have changed substantially. My colleagues in Centennial have done a study of the next 30 years for India, and our view is that India will grow by 8.5% per annum per capita terms over the next 30 years and become the second largest economy in the world by around 2036. 5% by China by then have a considerable presence and impact on the region. In case there are any skeptics out there, the most optimistic chapter of that book that we wrote was written by a Pakistani. So I think it's a fair, balanced view. We're also reasonably confident that Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Maldives would have sustained rapid economic growth and emerged as reasonably prosperous, reasonably dynamic economies. Pakistan and Nepal and Afghanistan have more problems, but I think it would be wrong to dismiss Pakistan as a failed state, as many people see it as becoming. I think it will be a distressed state for a while, but eventually I believe its problems will be resolved and it will resume growth. Let us not forget that in the 1960s, Pakistan was one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and with the right policies, the right leadership, I think it can get back to that level of dynamism. So Pakistan by 2060 will also, I think, achieve a certain level of dynamism and presence in the global economy. Despite the often tense bilateral relations in South Asia, we see economic integration in the region progressing. As many of the speakers before me pointed out, we should not be anchored just in the past and all the conflicts that currently dominate our thinking. I think incrementally I'm already seeing progress in certain elements of South Asian integration, and I suspect it will accelerate over time, and I think that's very positive. So that's roughly what the region will look like over the next 50 years. So what are the points I want to make? First, this issue about China as a South Asian power. To me, it has to be, because if you think of China as the largest economy in the world by 2060, its massive hunger for energy, for raw materials, and its huge dependence on the sea lanes of communication through the Indian Ocean means that the Indian Ocean will become a legitimate sphere of influence for China. And it will have investments, it will have markets, it will have sources of raw materials in many of the littoral states around the Indian Ocean. South Asia's likely economic and demographic trajectory will have made the countries in the region too large a market to avoid. So China's exports to South Asia will become a very important part of its own economy, thereby giving it an interest and a stake in the region. Within South Asia as well, India's neighbors could well see it in their interests to ally with China in order to contain potential risks emanating from India, whose massive size and likely military capabilities will make it a far more formidable adversary than it is now. And given its population by 2060, the likely size of the South Asian economy, and the probable technological capacity and so on, the fact is that India would probably be the only country, aside from the United States, that can challenge or rival China in any meaningful sense of the term. That in itself will require China to respond, to have some kind of precautionary strategy aimed at India, and that strategy must necessarily involve alliances of some kind with India's neighbors. So China becomes a South Asian power. Second, why do I think that the relationship between China and India is likely to be fraught? Well, some people say, well, you look at history, aside from 1962, which they argue is an aberration, the conflict of war in 1962 was an aberration. These countries, great civilizations, lived together in peace for thousands of years. Well, the reality is that they really didn't have much opportunity to rub against each other. While it is true that China had suzerainty over Tibet and Xinjiang, transportation technology and so on did not really allow these civilizations and countries to sort of rub against each other in any way that was involved conflict. There was no reason to. It's entirely different now. You have had the 62 war. It is not resolved. The memories are still there and it's still very painful. Tibet is still an unresolved issue. It's too strategic for China, and the coming eventual demise of the Dalai Lama and his succession is making Tibet a far more potent issue of conflict between China and India. Tibet also has a long border with Kashmir, which Pakistan asserts a claim over, in opposition to India's. China's military and diplomatic alliance with Pakistan, I think, complicates the relationship with India. China and India have yet to settle border disputes like Arunachal Pradesh, which India occupies, and asserts its sovereign territory. So, am I okay with that?
No, you're not. It's interesting.
No, I thought I had 15 minutes. Okay. So for a variety of reasons, I think China and India will have a difficult relationship. But the main reason is that when I talk to Chinese, members of the Chinese intellectual policy elite, talk to similar members of the Indian, I get a sense that these two civilizations really operate on totally different frequencies and wavelengths. And that makes me very worried. Because fundamentally, if there's this mutual misunderstanding, the chances of disagreement, conflict, tensions, whatever, will be so much higher. Third, the economic relationship between China and South Asia, I think, will be more complementary than competitive. I mean, there are different parts and different starting points in economic development, which means that they will be more likely to complement each other because they'll be at different stages of development. They have different competitive advantages, and I think that will help make the relationship more complementary. We are likely to see the manufacturing sectors in India and Bangladesh benefit from the fact that China will reach the Lewisian turning point at which, large surplus labor keeps wages down. That part of China's growth is almost over now, and we're going to see wages begin to accelerate over the next few years. And that rising wage cost is going to make push a lot of activities from China to only a few other countries can absorb those relocations. Indonesia, Brazil, Nigeria, and India, and Bangladesh, maybe Pakistan. Because you need large, populous countries with huge amounts of surplus labor to absorb that kind of thing. So South Asian economies will benefit from the differential path of growth, China versus South Asia. There will be some competitiveness, obviously. There will be competition, for instance, for natural resources between China and India and other large South Asian economies. There will be very large corporate sectors, indigenously owned companies in China and India, which will go out into the other parts of the world and compete to make acquisitions and so on. But I think taking it all together, I suspect there will be incredible room for synergies in complementary relationships. So to conclude, and Simon is looking at me with beady eyes, China and South Asia will become much more tied together economically and politically as we move towards 2060. China's considerable interest in South Asia will make it a South Asian power with legitimate interest, and somehow that will have to be accommodated. And I suspect that the process of getting there to that accommodation will unfortunately involve some degree of problems with India. But ultimately, one hopes that all that can be resolved. Thank you very much.
Manu, I'm sorry, you're my friend and I found the talk so interesting. It's just that time was running on, and maybe you should have had more time for the panel. But last but certainly not least, and I can't be mean to him after giving people more time, is Amitendu Palit from the ISIS, Institute of South Asian Studies. There's another Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. So if you say ISIS and ISIS, it sounds so similar. So Institute of South Asian Studies. So Palit, would you like to share with us your thoughts? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Simon Tay, and let me also take this opportunity on behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies to welcome you all to this program. There are certain advantages of speaking last, and maybe I can claim to have some of the last words on this, and I would like to begin with a framework that forms the path. I can infer that Adil persuaded me to write, and I'm glad that he actually successfully convinced me to do this because I learned a lot in the process. The central hypothesis of what I have been trying to develop here is that South Asia's position in the Asian economy over the next 40 to 50 years will be determined by 3 P's. First of these is potential, the second is people, and the third is politics. So it's basically the interaction and outcome between these 3 P's that's eventually going to decide what kind of a South Asia we'll see after 50 or 40 years. I'll not talk much about the potential, because the potential is much more widely discussed. Ambassador Pillai has touched upon several points, and I'm sure it's more in the public domain, but I'll try to focus more on the remaining 2. And let me start with some numbers, which as an economist I can never resist the temptation of using. At this point in time in 2010, East Asia and South Asia broadly have similar shares of the world population, and that's somewhere between 37 to 38%. Of course, for big countries, China and India, a few millions hardly matters. So 37 to 38 is roughly where they stand. 40 years later, these percentages are going to change rather remarkably. East Asia's share is going to come down to around 30% of the global population, and South Asia's is going to increase to 45%. And the main reason for that is that China and India are going to experience very different trajectories of population growth. From 2030 onward, China is actually going to experience a negative rate of growth of population. And that will have its impact upon the overall East Asian population, whereas in India's case, population will keep growing at rates between 0.5 to 0.8% per year. So what that essentially means is that since these two are the largest economies of their respective regions, East Asia's reducing share in global and Asian population will be by and large compensated by South Asia. And what that again means is that in another 5 to 10 years, and obviously in the distant future, South Asia is going to be the most populous region of the world. Which again comes to the second P that I mentioned, being the most populous region in the world. People are going to be the central of all that happens in South Asia and also all that doesn't happen in South Asia. Now, what does this demographic changes imply? The first obvious implication from an economic sense, it means more young people. And when we talk about more young people, we technically tend to call them more young people in the working age of the population. That's typically the 15 to 60 years age bracket. And in India's case, for example, by the year 2040, 65% of India's population will be in the age group of 15 to 60. And that's what has given rise to the celebrated euphoria over demographic dividend in India. Now, one of the obvious implications of this large number of young population is that in other parts of Asia, particularly the mature, high-income, labor-scarce parts of Asia, South Asia will continue to remain and probably become an even larger source of labor. That means migration continues to remain a major economic force and an economic determinant, and there will be both pull and push factors operating in this regard. The pull factor will arise from those countries which are looking out for cheap labor, and the push factor will arise from countries within South Asia, where it will be very important for their people to move to jobs, because with such rates of population growth, no kind of economic growth foreseeable in the next 20 years can actually produce as many jobs within South Asia which will satisfy this population growth. And the per capita incomes between South Asia and other high-income mature economies of Asia will continue to remain very different. And again, some statistics are rather stark in this regard. India, the largest economy of the region, has a per capita income of $1,017, which is 3.3% of that of Hong Kong, 5.3% of that of Korea, and 2.7% of Singapore. And though India's per capita income is expected to become double in another 10 years, it's impossible to conceive of a rate of GDP growth which will surpass the rate of population growth and breach these gaps in income. So from lower income countries, there will continuously be the push factor, pushing labor out of South Asian regions to other parts of Asia. One of the obvious, rather superficial observations from this trend could be that one might be tempted to conclude that Asian labor market in future will be overwhelmingly dominated by South Asians. Yes, insofar as stock of labor is concerned, but may not actually be so, because to a very large extent, whether it happens or not depends upon what kind of labor-saving productive innovations are taking place, particularly in the mature economies of South Asia like Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, Korea, and even China. But migration also ensures that remittances happen to remain one of the major decisive factors in determining the economic prospects in South Asian countries. India, as we know, is the largest recipient of inward remittances. Bangladesh and Pakistan are respectively the 12th and 17th largest. And there will continue to be an effect of remittances insofar as determining their economic outlooks are concerned. In addition to these migratory and demographic trends, there's another trend which is already intensifying in Asia and will intensify further. And that's the deepening, thickening, and widening of what Jagdish Bhagwati refers to as the spaghetti bowl. What that essentially means is that Asia is going to become more closely connected within its parts, primarily through trade agreements. And there would be swarms of this trade agreement covering all parts of Asia. South Asia has been a relatively late entrant to this game, and which essentially would imply that it's going to deploy more energy and resources towards construction of more trade agreements. What that means is that Asian production networks are going to become far more fragmented between countries, with some part of processes being located in different parts. Already certain interesting changes are happening. Say, for example, Levi's Jeans starts its basic operations from Taiwan, enters Cambodia and Bangladesh at the middle level, gets sold in US, and is eventually managed by Hong Kong. So these kind of chains are going to proliferate. More South Asian firms are going to enter this chain courtesy the labor agreements and the trade agreements. But the fact of the matter is that while this may sound very promising and may actually mean many promising manufacturing future for South Asian entrepreneurs, there is a considerable amount of technological gap that still exists in South Asia vis-a-vis the rest of Asia. And in fact, again, some studies in this regard point to some rather disappointing technological positions that South Asian countries have in the technological ladder. And there are groups of countries on one hand called technological leaders. This includes Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. There are potential leaders. Bahrain, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates. Latecomers is a group where only 2 South Asian countries figure, and these are India and Sri Lanka. Whereas much later in marginalized groups of countries, we find Bangladesh, Cambodia, Nepal, Laos, and Pakistan. So in terms of capacities to assimilate and adapt, technology will remain a barrier, though there could always be niches and areas where South Asian firms might perform better. But the bottom line is that when South Asian firms enter the Asian production chains, they are likely to figure more at the middle and lower end of activities till a number of years in the foreseeable future. We are aware of the fact that South Asia has a peculiar economic structure to itself, which hasn't really grown the way conventional economics would have supposed it to be grown. Seniors in most South Asian economies have actually been contributing very large proportions to their national outputs. Now, what this has meant is that there is a considerable amount of discussion that South Asian countries now do when they have trade negotiations with their partners in the rest of Asia. The India-ASEAN negotiations are an example, and similarly, negotiations that South Asian countries will have in future with their counterparts in Asia will have services dominating a large part of their discussions. Now, these probably have the possibility of creating some friction, because discussions on services tend to enter into certain areas which are very sensitive as far as domestic labor markets are concerned, particularly as far as movement of professionals are concerned. So that's something which South Asia will have to handle in a pragmatic manner. From a larger overall growth, performance, and trajectory division, there is a possibility, there is a thought which is gaining considerable ground that South Asia may find itself getting reorganized into some distinct economic blocks. And even within individual South Asian countries, there could be distinct economic blocks operating. One example could be India might have a different kind of growth trajectory vis-a-vis the rest of South Asia. So there could be 2 different economic blocks. One is India, the other comprising the non-Indian countries. Within India, there could be one part of India which is performing very, very differently from another part of India. So that's another distinct block. Now, is this a good thing to happen? It's probably not, because even from an Indian vantage point, surviving in a neighborhood which is economically challenged in a relative sense is something which India will not like to have, given the next negative externalities it can create on its growth. So in that sense, probably India will be better off paying a little more attention to a greater, cohesive, and economically prosperous neighborhood. But let me now come to politics, because that's eventually going to decide much of what South Asia will going to encounter in future. And this is where South Asia will continue to grapple with what has been its biggest challenge, growth versus equity. Because a large part of growth in South Asia has not been equitable, and unfortunately, I really cannot, from the current history, come to a conclusion that growth in immediate future will become far more egalitarian than what it is right now. And even if for a country like India, it continues to have double-digit GDP growth. Whether it will be able to make that growth egalitarian is a huge question. It is a huge question because the quality of political economy in the region has been rather disappointing, and history clearly suggests political economy of the region in recent times has been revolving more around the agendas of specific interest groups rather than the core concerns of people. And to give an example, civil society activism in South Asia has reached a situation where some of the outcomes are very counterproductive. Industrialization leading to displacement is being opposed, which should be opposed probably, but no alternatives are being suggested. Now, as a result of such civil society actions and branding of political economy, agitations are seen to be becoming more agenda-driven than concern-driven. So that's a concern that South Asia has to live with for a very long time. So what that essentially means is that if these three P's, potential, people, and politics, are eventually managed in a harmonious manner, South Asia will obviously have a better economic future. But for doing so, it probably needs to deploy one more fourth P, and that fourth P is pragmatism. Now, if it can have a pragmatic approach towards the better management of these three P's, it can definitely do far, far better. And in that regard, it will probably do very well to look at its neighborhood, particularly in Southeast Asia and East Asia, where pragmatism has actually played one of the most important roles in economic prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think all three of the panelists have given us much to speak about. But unfortunately, I as the chairperson has failed to keep time completely. So we're completely out of time for questions. But I think with your indulgence, we could take one or two in case there are people who really want to ask or make a point. And I'll take the gentleman nearest the... please go ahead. Please introduce yourself and make a comment portion.
My name is Nitin Pai from the Takshila Institution, a think tank. I'll make a quick comment. I think one of the points here is how much does the near future impact the far future. And in this, I'm talking about regionalism itself. If India recognizes that the region as such is not conducive to its growth process and its aspirations in the near future, it might so decide to ignore the region entirely, which means by the year 2060, there wouldn't be a South Asia at all, because India would be much integrated with the rest of the world, the West and the East. And the South Asia as a region has to decide whether it exists or not.
Interesting provocative question. We'll see the gentleman there, and one more there, please. And if there's a lady with a question, I think we should have some gender balance. Please go ahead.
Professor Najam, it's interesting that you mentioned cricket as one of the themes in your book. Cricket can be a profoundly binding factor within South Asia, but it can also be very divisive. So we use Orwell's famous phrase, war minus shooting. But in recent times, before the unfortunate breakup of cricket relations after 26/11, actually India-Pakistan games have become less of a life and death matter. It was treated more as a normal sort of everyday game, which is a hopeful sign, I think, for South Asian future in the near term, maybe not the long term.
Thank you. And the last comment or question, please.
Thank you. This is directed both to Professor Najam and Bhaskaran. The cluster of queries. One, while we know the dangers of monocausal explanation, for study, identify any particular dimension, such as strategy or demography, culture, civilization, or whatever, as being a key driver of this future scenario. Two, if you look back in 1960 as you recommended, we would see that the fate of South Asia was impacted upon quite heavily by the Cold War. Similarly, do you see the US-China competition as having an impact on the future of South Asia from now to 2060 and so on? Three, outlier or black swan events like a possible military confrontation involving Iran, because we have a build-up now. Have you factored this in to your futuristic scenarios? Four, the India-China contradiction, which has been referred to here as a likely prospect. This could have, of course, complete havoc on South Asia as a whole. And don't you think, therefore, in conclusion, that there has to be greater conscious cooperation between Southeast and South Asia in order to try to manage the India-China contradiction, particularly as it would play out in South Asia? Thank you.
Thank you. I think on the last one, it was really Manu Bhaskaran who talked about India-China tensions. It'd be interesting to draw the others as to whether they share or disagree with this view. So those are the four questions, unless there is a lady for gender equality. If not, yes, thank you. Please come to the microphone and state your question or comment.
Good evening, distinguished panelists. My name is Rosalie. I'm a law student at the Singapore Management University. My question is, it seems like most of the speakers have structured your vision of South Asia 2060 in a political, economic way and model, and talking about the geopolitics. I was just wondering about the environmental sustainability issues, and what is your comment on that, as well as the quality of life issue? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you are all seasoned panelists, and I don't think I have to let you into the questions. So fire away. Adil, would you like to start? Responses?
Sure.
You don't take everything on.
No.
What you want.
I won't, even when I'm prone to usually. Very quickly, I think you're right. The choice of, the first question that was asked, the choice of which of near-term choices are important, but it is not just, how much does the near-term impact, it is also what in the near-term impact. What in the near-term is irreversible. And I do fear that we keep gravitating to the more sexy parts of the near-term. The permanent parts of the near-term are things like people, the age structure. This goes to the fourth question about drivers. One of the things which I think right now we haven't, I pushed the authors, but we haven't talked as much about in the book, is what happens to age, not just how many people. And we think about age usually as youth. It's not just youth, but also what happens to age at sort of the agedness, and how the region deals with that. When you look at those numbers, it becomes very, very important. So what in the future I think is more important than weather. The cricket point, I sound facetious, but I'm not. Partly it's because my first paying job was as a sports reporter. The first time I visited India, I was with the cricket team to cover the series, but I do think it's a very important part. I don't mind, the seriousness of what the fans do. But if you think about cricket not simply as a metaphor, but as an economy, one of the areas where there's actual labor movement, not high in numbers, but high in cash, is cricket, if you think about IPL. The other is Bollywood. If you think about where in India do Pakistanis work in high-profile jobs, it is as singers and cricketers. If you think about the size of the cricket economy and how intertwined it is immense. Again, I'm not trying to be facetious. Let me put the third thing. The one and largest area in which India and Pakistan in particular, but South Asian countries in general, have collaborated at a massive international level is hosting not one, but 2 Cricket World Cups together, and now nearly about to do a third. Show me another area where organizationally, at that level of international visibility, these countries have come together to do something. So I really sort of, my point is that you have to look outside of the usual frameworks to see how these things move. It's not just cricket, again, Bollywood is important. 3 years ago, there's a program in India called The Funniest Man in India. 3 years ago, the funniest man in India turned out to be a Pakistani. It is not insignificant, it's the creation of the South Asian identity. And you start breaking those molds. So those to me are some of the things I need to be honest.
Thank you. Just 2 points. One is the question on US-China relations and its impact in South Asia. I think the way I look at it is that both China and India are they're very large countries with long histories and very conscious of the fact that they are giants in their own way. And I don't think these powers will want to be used against each other. And I certainly don't think that India wants to be used by the US to contain China. I think it's very conscious of that and will try to avoid being a pawn in the equation. So I suspect India, as large power, will chart its own course and try to stay clear of this. But when it is convenient, it will form an alliance with one against the other, a tripartite relationship. The India-China problems and what role Southeast Asia might have, it is very much in ASEAN's interest for it to have a peaceful region around it. And in the same way that ASEAN has formed the platform for ASEAN plus 3, since the North Asian countries couldn't get together before, and they got together as a result of this, maybe ASEAN can be a kind of bridge between India and China.
Just a quick response to the first point, South Asia as a region and whether India should be comfortable with that identity or not. Well, as I mentioned, economically there's every possibility of India being recognized as a distinct economic identity by itself separate from the region. Now, whether that's a good outcome for India or not is something that I'm not sure about, because India's periods of good, solid, sturdy economic growth have come at times when the external environment has been benign. That's very clearly shown in the histories of its growth. So I'm not too sure whether the externalities of surviving in a neighborhood, which is not what's very clear, is something that would be good for the Indian economy in the long run.
Well, thank you very much. I think that this has been a very exciting talk for me. I have been to India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, never Bangladesh so far, but in a sense, I think like many Singaporeans, I am still less cognizant of South Asia, than I am of Northeast and Southeast Asia. So I think I've learned a lot, a tremendous amount from the panelists as well as the two distinguished ambassadors before them. I think that Singapore, though, is very well placed to really be an interlocutor for many South Asians with Southeast Asia. I think that the South Asian mindshare in Singapore is actually much higher than it is perhaps in Indonesia or certainly Laos, other countries like that. I mean, it's not unknown to them. But I think here, because of our politics, our people, and also our recognition of the vast potential of South Asia, I think Singapore has made every possible effort to try to engage with South Asia, not just for the short term, but really as a kind of a strand in the future of our own city-state. So I would like to close by thanking all the partners and the speakers. In particular, I'd like to thank the SWA team, the SWA which I closed, a non-profit organization, and really have depended a lot on the staff, very small team. And in this case also our interns, including Ms. Ram from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, who has been working on this project for some months during the summer. And Adil Najam mentioned that Elaine Teng used to be our SWA staff. It is a happy coincidence that when she went to Boston to do her master's and I think a PhD now at Harvard, she decided also to work with the Pardee Center. It was my pleasure to recommend her and to welcome her back to Singapore for Adil. So thank you all, and thank you Elaine, and thank you all for coming.
We'd like to give our a token of appreciation to some of our guests, so we just stay around for a little bit for that. Yes. Simon, can I invite you to stand in front? We'd like to thank our guests for speaking as well as for being here. First up, we would like to invite Dr. Radhavan. Thank you very much. Ambassador Gopinath Pillai. Dr. Adil. Mr. Bhaskaran. and Dr. Palit. We'd also like to thank our partners, the Frederick S. Pardee Center, for the study of the longer range future, the Institute of South Asian Studies, Singapore, as well as our venue partners, the National Library, for being our venue sponsor. Thank you very much for coming. We wish you a pleasant evening.
All enough.